So you're welcome to this tutorial on homeostasis and feedback mechanisms. This presentation will guide you through answering the exam question, define homeostasis and explain the feedback mechanisms using clear examples. I'll show you how to structure your answer, what key points to include, and how to present examples effectively. You'll have a clear framework for tackling similar exam questions by the end. Alright, so before we dive into the details of homeostasis itself, let's first take a look at how you should approach this essay question in your exam. A clear structure helps you stay organized and earn full marks for content, flow, and presentation. Now start with a concise introduction. One paragraph is enough. Define homeostasis clearly in your own words and state why it's important for the body's survival. Examiners love it when students start strong with clarity and purpose. Next, move to a short overview of feedback mechanisms. Mention that there are two main types, negative feedback and the positive feedback, and briefly describe how each one functions. These paragraphs set the stage for your detailed discussion later. Then go deeper into negative feedback, which usually forms the core of your answer. Spend 2 or 3 paragraphs here. Explain how the mechanism works step by step. Stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, and response. Support it with 1 or 2 well-explained physiological examples like temperature or blood glucose regulation. After that, include a shorter section on positive feedback, 1 or 2 paragraphs. Explain the principle and give one clear example such as childbirth or blood clotting. Finally, write a conclusion summarizing the key differences between the two feedback types and re-emphasizing why homeostasis is essential for survival. And here's an exam tip. Aim to spend 15 to 20 minutes on this question. Use headings or paragraph breaks to make your answer easy to follow. Remember, clarity, logical flow, and accuracy always stand out to your examiner. So this is your map. Once you follow it, you will cover every major point neatly and confidently. Now let's move into the first part of your answer, definition of homeostasis, which forms the opening paragraph. When you start your essay, begin with confidence and clarity. The examiner should immediately know that you understand what the term homeostasis means. You can define it this way. Homeostasis is the process by which living organisms maintain a stable internal environment despite changes in external conditions. This definition tells us 3 key things. It's a process, it's about stability, and it's achieved despite external changes. But don't just memorize the line. Show understanding. Emphasize that homeostasis is an active, dynamic process, not a fixed or static condition. The body constantly monitors, adjusts, and regulates internal variables like temperature, blood pH, and glucose levels to keep them within a narrow, optimal range. Should also make it clear that this internal stability happens even when the environment outside the body changes. For instance, when we move from a cool room into a hot sun or eat after fasting. So your first paragraph should define homeostasis clearly, show that it's an active regulatory process, and highlight its role in maintaining balance within the internal environment. Which, funny, the internal environment, also known as a milieu interior, ironically, refers to the extracellular fluid that bathes all the cells of the body, providing them with nutrients and removing waste products, thereby maintaining the stable conditions necessary for life. After clearly defining homeostasis, the next thing you should do in your opening paragraph is to back up your definition with examples. it shows the examiner that you understand homeostasis not just as a concept, but as a real physiological process that applies to daily body function. You can mention 2 or 3 examples, such as body temperature, which is maintained around 37 degrees Celsius, blood glucose levels, which are kept between about 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter, and blood pH, which stays usually close to 7.4. You can also add water and electrolyte balance as another example, showing how the kidneys regulate fluid levels and iron concentration to maintain stability. Each variable fluctuates slightly but stays within a narrow range. That's the essence of homeostasis. Relative constancy, not absolute rigidity like some of us. Okay, so exam tip: always start your essay with a solid definition, then follow it with 2 or 3 well-chosen examples. This immediately signals the examiner that you have a practical grasp of the concept. A good rule is definition earns marks, examples earn extra marks, so don't skip them. So now that you defined homeostasis and given clear examples, the next paragraph should explain how the body maintains that internal balance. And this is where feedback mechanisms come in. You can write something like this in your answer. Homeostasis is maintained through feedback mechanisms, which are control systems that detect changes in the internal environment and trigger appropriate responses. There are 2 main types of feedback mechanisms. That's the negative feedback and the positive feedback. Now, this single paragraph acts as a bridge between your definition and the detailed discussion that follows. Be sure to explain briefly that feedback mechanisms work like automatic control loops. They constantly monitor internal conditions, compare them to a normal set point, and then activate responses that either reverse or amplify a change, depending on the situation. By doing this, your essay flows naturally and reads like a well-planned explanation, not a list of facts. The next step is to briefly distinguish between them before explaining each in detail. Start by stating that negative feedback is the most common type. It accounts for about 95% of all homeostatic control mechanisms. Its primary function is to reverse or counteract deviation from the normal set point. In other words, when a physiological variable moves away from normal, negative feedback brings it back to balance. This is the mechanism that keeps your body temperature, blood sugar, and pH levels stable day to day. On the other hand, positive feedback does the opposite. It amplifies or enhances the original change. So rather than restoring balance immediately, it pushes the process further until a specific goal is achieved, like childbirth or blood clotting. After that goal is reached, the system resets and returns to normal. An exam tip is this: always mention that negative feedback is a predominant mechanism in maintaining homeostasis. This one sentence shows the examiner that you understand the definitions and their relative importance in physiology. Keeping this distinction clear in your essay makes the following sections, where you explain each type in detail, much easier to follow. So we've come to the most critical part of this topic, and that's the negative feedback. This is the primary mechanism through which the body maintains homeostasis, which you must understand and describe clearly in your exam. Here's how it works. Negative feedback functions to reverse or oppose a change in a controlled variable, bringing it back towards the normal set point. It's like the body's built-in correction system. Whenever a variable drifts away from normal, a response is triggered to pull it back into range. It definitely just means that negative feedback reverses changes to restore the normal set point. Okay, so after that, you can then describe the 5-step process. You can think of it as a loop, a control system with a series of coordinated steps. First, a stimulus produces a change in the internal environment. The receptors detect that change and send information to a control center, often the brain or an endocrine gland. The control center compares the new value with the normal set point and sends commands to effectors, that's muscles or glands, which act to reverse the change. Once the variable returns to normal, the corrective response stops, completing the loop. You can see the stimulus, receptor. You see stimulus, yes, receptor, control center, effector, and the final response. Now, in your essay, it's important to highlight that this process maintains stability through continuous adjustments, not by keeping conditions perfectly constant, but by keeping them within healthy limits. By explaining negative feedback in this logical, step-by-step way, you show clear understanding, and that's what examiners are exactly looking for. Now, emphasize that the key principle is opposition. The response counteracts the stimulus, and you can draw a simple arrow diagram showing these steps in your exam. You can probably, you don't need to put the boxes, just the words and the arrows are enough to show this. Now, let's just quickly scroll through what we're talking about since. Now, let's break down the key features of the feedback, negative feedback that you should always mention in your answer. First, the response opposes or negates the original stimulus. This means that whatever change occurs in the body, the system acts in the opposite direction to correct it. For instance, if body temperature rises, mechanisms like sweating and vasodilation help bring it back down. Second, negative feedback returns the variable back toward its set point. That's the normal physiological range. It doesn't overshoot or push it into an extreme. It restores balance. Third, this process creates stability and prevents extreme fluctuations. It's what keeps internal conditions steady even when the environment changes, ensuring enzymes, cells, and organs continue to function efficiently. And finally, negative feedback operates continuously. It is not something that switches on occasionally. It's always active in the background, making the fine adjustments to maintain homeostasis throughout the day. Exam tip: if time allows, draw a simple flow diagram in your essay. For example, stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, response, restored balance. Just join all of these with arrows. A clear labeled diagram can make your explanation stand out really and earn you extra marks for presentation and understanding. So remember, when writing about negative feedback, focus on how it reverses change, maintains stability, and operates continuously. Your first example should be body temperature regulation, also called thermoregulation. It's the classic example of negative feedback. Structure it systematically using the 5 steps. It's one of the best examples to use in your essay because it clearly shows every step of the feedback loop. You can write it like this. Scenario: the body temperature rises above the normal level at about 37 degrees Celsius, for instance, during exercise or in a hot environment. Stimulus: the increase in body temperature is the initial disturbance. Receptors: thermoreceptors in the skin and hypothalamus detect this rise. Control center: the hypothalamus acts as the control center. It compares the new temperature to the normal set point and decides corrective actions. Effectors and response: the sweat glands are activated to produce sweat, and the evaporation of sweat helps cool the body. Blood vessels in the skin dilate, This vasodilation increases blood flow near the surface, allowing more heat to escape. The result? The body temperature gradually decreases towards 37 degrees centigrade. That's the normal set point. And the corrective responses slow down or stop once the balance is restored. This example perfectly illustrates how negative feedback reverses deviation and restores the system to normal. Now, a simple way to summarize in your essay is when body temperature rises, the hypothalamus triggers cooling mechanisms. Warming mechanisms are activated when it falls. Both responses restore the set point through negative feedback. This level of detail shows understanding, organization, and physiological accuracy, exactly what examiners are looking for. For an exam tip, you can use these numbered formats in your exam. It shows systematic thinking and ensures you don't miss any steps. Always end by stating that the variable returns to normal. For your second negative feedback example, blood glucose regulation works well. Notice this example is written in paragraph form rather than the numbered steps. Both formats are acceptable in exams. Start by describing the scenario. Blood glucose rises after eating. Explain that beta cells in the pancreas detect this rise and release insulin. Then describe insulin's effect. It makes cells absorb glucose and causes the liver to store it as glycogen. Conclude by stating that glucose levels return to normal. Including a second example shows comprehensive knowledge. Though in time-limited exams, one detailed example may be sufficient if thoroughly explained. So let's use this for like a teaching process, a learning process, instead of just managing answers. Here we have one of the most well-known examples of negative feedback. That's the regulation of blood glucose levels by insulin and glucagon. The mechanism keeps the blood sugar concentration within a healthy range, usually between 70 and 100 milligrams per deciliter. Let's walk through the cycle step by step. Now, when blood glucose levels rise, for example, after a meal, this change is detected by the pancreas, specifically by the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans. The pancreas responds by secreting insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin travels to tissue cells, particularly in muscle, fat, and the liver, and stimulates these cells by taking up glucose from the blood. In the liver, insulin also promotes the conversion of glucose to glycogen for storage. As a result, blood glucose levels decrease, returning towards the normal set point. Once the level is back to normal, the stimulus, that's high glucose, is removed and insulin secretion drops. Now, the reverse happens when blood glucose levels fall, such as during fasting or prolonged exercise. This time, the alpha cells of the pancreas detect the drop and release glucagon. Glucagon acts mainly on the liver, where it stimulates the breakdown of glycogen to glucose and its release into the bloodstream. This raises the blood glucose concentration back to normal. Now, I'm sure you can notice the pattern here. Insulin lowers blood sugar when it's high. Glucagon raises it when it's low. Both hormones work in opposite directions, maintaining balance through negative feedback. Now, the key idea, every time glucose levels drift away from the normal, the body's response reverses the change. That's the hallmark of negative feedback. So in your essay, back to the answering of questions. So in your essay, if you are describing this example, emphasize the dual hormone control. the direction of regulation, and the return to equilibrium. That's what demonstrates full understanding. Another exam tip, you can write examples either in numbered steps or in a paragraph form like this. Both are acceptable. Choose the format you're most comfortable with, but be consistent. Now let's return to the second type of feedback mechanism. That's the positive feedback mechanism. It's less common than negative feedback, but still important to understand because it explains certain biological processes that must run to completion rather than maintain balance. Here's how it works. Now, unlike negative feedback, which reverses the change to restore stability, positive feedback amplifies or enhances the original stimulus. The response actually pushes the variable further in the same direction as the initial change. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Once it starts, each step strengthens the next, and the process continues until a specific endpoint or goal is achieved. After that point, the loop stops and normal balance or homeostasis is restored. You can think of positive feedback as the body's way of saying, come on, let's finish this process completely before we return to normal. Even though it's temporary, it plays a vital role in key physiological events like childbirth and blood clotting, which we'll look at in the coming slides. Remember, when writing your essay, always point out that positive feedback reinforces rather than reverses, and that it continues only until a specific outcome is reached. Now let's look at a very good example of positive feedback in the human body. That's childbirth, also known as parturition. Now this example is often used in exams because it shows the feedback cycle very clearly from start to finish. Here's how to describe it step by step in your answer. Start by, as labor begins, the baby's head pushes against the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus. The pressure is detected by stretch receptors in the cervix. These receptors send signals to the hypothalamus and pituitary gland in the brain. The hypothalamus processes this information and stimulates the posterior pituitary to release a hormone called oxytocin into the bloodstream. The released oxytocin travels through the bloodstream to the uterine muscles, causing them to contract more strongly. These stronger contractions push the baby's head even harder against the cervix, which causes more stretching, triggering the release of more oxytocin and leading to even stronger contractions. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle that continues to intensify as labor progresses. The cycle keeps repeating until the baby is delivered. Once the baby is born, the pressure on the cervix is removed, the stretch receptors stop firing, oxytocin release falls, and the system returns to normal. Well, the key lesson here is that positive feedback amplifies the process to completion, not to maintain stability. It's temporary, goal-directed, and self-limiting, ending as soon as the desired outcome, in this case childbirth, is achieved. And when you write this in your exam, use these clear sequence. You can label each stage as stimulus, detection, control, response, amplification, and endpoint. This shows that you understand both the mechanism and the logic behind it. Let's highlight the key features of positive feedback. The points you should always include when explaining it in your essay. First, the response enhances or intensifies the original stimulus. That means instead of bringing the system back to normal, the body's response actually pushes it further in the same direction. Second, positive feedback creates a self-amplifying cycle. Once it begins, each step reinforces the next, making the process stronger until it reaches completion. Third, the cycle continues only until a specific goal or endpoint is achieved. After that, the loop automatically stops. For instance, once a baby is delivered or your wound is sealed, the stimulus is removed and the feedback cycle shuts down. Fourth, unlike negative feedback, which operates continuously to maintain balance, positive feedback is temporary and used only for special processes that need to be completed. That's why it's relatively rare in the body. An exam tip: always emphasize the contrast between the two mechanisms. So something like negative feedback maintains stability by reversing change, while positive feedback drives specific processes by reinforcing change and stops once the goal is reached. This comparison shows the examiner that you understand both systems in relation to each other, which is exactly what earns high marks. Here you can see a format you can easily, an outline you can easily follow to put down positive feedback, talking about using childbirth as an example. Your final paragraph should be a strong conclusion. You can include a comparison table in your answer, that's if time allows you, though it's optional. In your concluding statements, briefly recap the key differences. Negative feedback reverses changes and it's continuous, while positive feedback amplifies changes and is temporary. Emphasize that negative feedback is the dominant mechanism for maintaining homeostasis, and by stating why these mechanisms are important to ensure survival by maintaining optimal conditions and completing necessary processes. As you come to the end of your essay, it's important to finish with a clear summary that compares negative and positive feedback. This shows the examiner that you understand how the two systems differ, yet work together to maintain physiological balance and control. Let's take a quick look at the key differences shown in this table. Negative feedback reverses or opposes a change. It stabilizes the internal environment. Positive feedback, on the other hand, amplifies or enhances the change. It drives a process to completion. Talking about the duration, negative feedback operates continuously as part of the body's day-to-day regulation. It never stops. Positive feedback is temporary. It runs only until the specific endpoint is reached. Then switches off. Examples for negative feedback: can mention temperature regulation, blood glucose control, and blood pressure regulation. For positive feedback, cite childbirth, blood clotting, or lactation. Now, in your concluding paragraph, bring everything together with a statement like this: homeostasis depends primarily on negative feedback to maintain internal stability, while positive feedback plays supportive roles in special processes that must be completed before normal balance is restored. An exam tip: a short, well organized conclusion leaves a strong impression. It shows you didn't just memorize facts, you understood relationships between mechanisms, their purposes, and their physiological importance. And that's exactly what we examiners look for in an excellent essay on homeostasis. So I've documented a concluding statement here that you can probably use for um, your own conclusion. And like I said earlier, a strong conclusion that summarizes the key differences and emphasizes their importance, demonstrates comprehensive understanding, and leaves a good final impression. All right, so this is the final checkpoint before you hand in your answer. quickly to make sure you've covered everything that earns full marks in homeostasis essay. Let's go through the checklist together. First, make sure you've started with a clear definition of homeostasis, using proper scientific terms like stable internal environment and physiological regulation. You must also not leave out despite changes in the external environment, despite external changes. Now, this is your foundation. If it is strong, your whole essay flows better. Next, include 2 or 3 examples of variables that are regulated. Things like body temperature, blood glucose, or pH. Examples show you understand what homeostasis looks like in action. Then check that you've explained both feedback mechanisms, negative feedback, not just listed them. Show how each one works, not just what it does. Now, have you given a detailed description of negative feedback? That means mentioning the full control loop, stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, and response. Include at least one well-explained negative feedback example, either temperature regulation or blood glucose control. It's better to write one detailed example than several shallow ones. Don't forget to explain positive feedback as well and how it differs. Then give one clear example like childbirth, which is the easiest and most widely accepted in exams. Finally, make sure your essay has a comparison between the two types and ends with a short conclusion summarizing their importance in maintaining homeostasis. Now, your final tip before before submitting, quickly skim your essay and ask yourself, have I explained the how, not just the what? This single question can make the difference between a good answer and an excellent one. So breathe, structure your thoughts, and write with confidence. You've got all the tools to earn top marks. Before you close your notebooks, let's have a quick reality check. These are the classic traps that even bright students fall into when answering questions on homeostasis. Let's make sure you don't. Mistake 1. Mixing up the 2 feedback types. If you take only one thing from this lesson, let it be this: negative feedback reverses, positive feedback reinforces. Negative feedback keeps things stable, positive feedback finishes the job. Don't let them swap roles in your essay. Mistake 2. Saying what happens, but not how it happens. Remember, examiners love process. Don't just write. The body regulates temperature. Show how. Stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, response. That simple sequence can earn you extra marks every single time. Mistake 3. Giving vague examples. Temperature control. That alone won't impress anyone. Add a little sparkle. Mention sweating, vasodilation, or shivering. Specific examples prove you actually understand what's happening inside the body. Mistake 4. Forgetting who's the main player. Negative feedback runs the show. Around 95% of all homeostatic control. So always make that clear. It shows you know which system keeps us alive day to day. Mistake 5. Letting positive feedback go on forever. Nope, it doesn't. Positive feedback is like a dramatic scene in a movie. It builds up tension, reaches a climax, and ends. Once the baby is born or the clot is formed, the cycle stops. That's your cue to end the explanation too. Think of negative feedback as a calm manager, keeping order, and positive feedback as an intense sprinter that is finishing a task. Use that mental picture and you'll never mix them up again. And with that, you've mastered how to write a complete, confident essay on homeostasis. structure, examples, and all. Remember, time management. Spend most of your time on negative feedback since it's the primary mechanism. Don't rush positive feedback, but keep it proportionate. Finally, always leave time to write a conclusion and quickly review your answer. Following this tutorial framework will help you craft comprehensive, well-structured answers that earn top marks.